Grant's Gamble, The Wilderness Campaign, 1864. This is a game by Worthington Game, a war game, and it is the first volume in a new system, in a new series called Blue and Gray Campaign Series. Promising premise here is that the games in the system rely on the same core engine. So once you know the rules for one of them, you can play the other ones too. And there are 3 volumes that are out so far. This is the first, and I'm going to play and review the other ones in the next future. Grant's Gamble covers the Wilderness Campaign of 1864. And what it does, it adds a couple of extra wrinkles of unique touches to the core engine. This is something that's very attractive to war gamers that like detail, like theme and chrome, but do not necessarily like to study long manuals every time that they play a new game. Having a core engine and then simply having to learn the specific aspects of a game based on that engine shortens the learning process, eases the pain. And here, actually, the core engine is already simple enough. Worthington is really has this, we could say, in their philosophy. In many of their war games, they try to have very short rule books with very essential, very economic rules that nevertheless somehow capture as much historical detail as possible. And this is definitely what happens here. The rules are some 4 or 5 pages of rules. They're very smart rules, actually, that do a good job of really distillating a lot of historical detail. And then you have, again, the unique rules to tailor the core rules to specific situations. So in this video, I'm going to tell you about the core engine in general, and then we're gonna talk about the specific aspects of the campaign represented in Grant's Gamble. Let's start with a general look at the map. The map is printed on thick cardstock and it lays flat quite nicely without any need to put a piece of plexiglass on it. The map depicts the area around Richmond and Petersburg, and these are the main areas that the Confederate player is trying to defend. At the beginning of the game, the Confederate players sets up units in this area here, forming a line of defense there, and there's another line of defense there. The Union player comes from the north with the majority of his pieces, but there is also going to be a presence here, and a presence here threatening the area around Richmond and Petersburg. As you can see, it is a point-to-point map. It looks both nice and functional. I don't have any complaint about this map, really. Well, sometimes there are large groups of blocks that may end up in cities, in areas that are close to each other, but I didn't find that to be really a problem. Didn't create any ambiguity. Definitely a good map. Combat units in this game are represented by wooden blocks that will stand on the board facing the owning player, so the opponent knows where the enemy units are, but not exactly the identity and the values on those units. Even though in this game there really aren't many blocks on the board, so after a while you get to know your opponent and the location of your opponent pretty well. In any case, there are numbers printed on the edges of the block, and those indicate the number of strength points that the unit presently has. The number that is on top of the unit tells you how strong the unit is. When the unit takes a hit, you simply record that by rotating the block, and the value can also go up if the unit receives replacements. Now, as you can see, this unit has a starting number of 12 combat points or strength points, and the unit is actually represented by 3 blocks. These 3 blocks represent the same unit. When this unit goes down to 9 points and takes a further hit, it is replaced by this other block. It keeps taking hits, goes on to 5 and takes another hit, then it goes on to 4. And so the unit can go anywhere between 12 and 1 point. I guess you can also say that it can go down to 0. That's a possible state in the game for this poor unit if it goes down to 0. Other values here are morale, that you see here in the star, and the number of dice that the unit rolls in combat here in the circle. And what I really like, as you can see, is the number of dice that the unit rolls in combat, and the morale goes down with the hits that with the number of hits that the unit takes. taking a lot of hits reduces the morale of the combat unit. This is very important, especially for the Confederate player, because the Confederate player may not be able to destroy any of the armies of the opponent, but by lowering their morale may reduce their effectiveness, force them to retreat from combat, and that is something that buys time to the Confederate player, and that is something the Confederate player desperately needs. This is a large combat unit, a large infantry unit. There are also units that are smaller, represented by one or two blocks only. For example, garrisons are represented by a single block. You also have cavalry units. Cavalry units are a little abstract in this game. They don't participate in combat directly. Their role is to screen, that is, to try to delay the opponent. As you can see, cavalry units only have one value, which is a single number, and that is the screening value. When an enemy unit moves into a location that only contains a cavalry unit of the opponent, then the moving unit has to take a test. You roll a die for the moving unit. If the die roll, the result is equal to or lower than the screening number of the cavalry unit, the screening was successful. The moving unit has to stop moving. Other units of the same side may move into that location but not past that location, and the successful cavalry unit retreats by one location. If the check was not successful for the screening unit, so the die roll was higher than the screening value, then the moving unit can keep moving and the cavalry has to retreat by 3 locations. So that is pretty much what the cavalry does. Also, of course, we have leaders, very important here, represented by a single block, and leaders will grant special abilities to the controlling player. And that, of course, what the ability is depends on the leader and depends on the game in the system. And this game particularly allows Confederate blocks to react to movement of the opponent. So blocks that are in the same location as Lee can move during the opponent's turn as a reaction to the opponent moves. And Grant allows his units an extra roll in combat during the morale checks. So his units are particularly motivated and they have a better chance of not failing a morale check. Now, how do you move units and activate units? Oh, I'm glad you asked. At the beginning of each turn, well, first at the beginning of each turn, you have a roll to determine the weather. Weather may be clear, rain, and there is a special circumstance in case it rains for 2 turns in a row or more. Of course, rain and protracted rain will slow down movement, otherwise movement happens without penalty. Each player receives a number of command points each turn. The game system, well, the scenario book for the game in the system that you're playing will tell you how many standard points you get. Then you also roll each turn to determine if you get an extra command point. Each side has a overall command value for the army. That is simply an abstract value. It doesn't represent an individual commander specifically. But you roll 2 dice at the beginning of the game. You compare that with your general command value, and if you rolled equal to or higher than that value, then you get an extra command point. Then you spend your command points to activate your units. Each command point activates a single unit on the board. Units that are activated get to move, and the infantry unit moves by 3 spaces, and leaders and cavalry by 4. Movement is point to point, so you simply move from a location to another using connected roads or railroads. Also, some special movements are available. For example, it is possible for the Union player to move from one port to another. It is possible to move by railroads, not by walking on the railroad, so using the railroad as a normal road, but it's also possible in the system to use railroad movement, so you spend command points to move from one area from one area on the railroad to any other area connected to the same railroad. And there's implementation of the system, only the Confederate player can use that special type of movement. This is very important. In many block games where you have action points, you activate a unit, or you activate a location, then you activate all the blocks in that location. Here, no, you activate units by individually, which is very important. because it presents challenges for the Confederate, for the Union player, an advantage for the Confederate player. The Union player can put together some massive armies, but then if you simply do not have the command points to activate them all, you have to divide them in smaller groups, and so maybe you have an army that is very large, but you can only move 3 units from that army in a turn. So that represents the problem of moving large armies, and does that in an elegant way that also presents interesting command decisions and game decisions. So first, a side will spend command points and move, and by moving, the moving side, the active side, may have placed blocks in the same location as there are blocks of the opponent. So after a side has moved, you resolve battles in all locations that contain blocks of both sides. You resolve all those battles, then the opponent takes their turn, which works in the same way. Spending command points to move units, and then resolving all battles that may have resulted from the movement of the active player. Combat is resolved using this battle board here, so you transfer blocks from the location where the battle is happening to this board here, and then you move them back to the main board. The attacker will place their units in this area here. There's a line position, which is the main combat area, but the attacker may have the first turn of combat to place units in this area of the battle board, the river area or the mountain area, in case the units came from that direction. So if I cross the river when I enter battle, or if I went through a mountain, I have to place my units here for the first round. Which means, since units may come from different directions, that the first round of combat there may be units that are already in the main line position and units that still are suffering the penalty for coming from another place. And in that case, I have to place them there. Suppose this could be a way. Then we have the reserve area where commanders and cavalry units go. And the opponent does the same, also places commanders and cavalry in reserve. The defender, however, will place units either in the main line position directly, like in that case, and or they may be in a fortified city if the location that is being attacked is a fortified city. Fortified cities, as indicated here, will give a certain number of blocks a special defense. So, which allows them to roll extra dice in combat. So suppose that this is the case, we're defending, say, Richmond. Then Richmond allows me to place 2 blocks in the fortified area. Then I set up the board like this. The battle is ready to start. The way it works is that first the defender rolls a hit. So you roll a number of dice equal to the number indicated on the blocks, modified by various circumstances. For example, being in the river area, the mountain area reduces the numbers of dice that you roll by 1. Being a fortified area increases the number by 2. So that's pretty neat. So first the defender rolls all of their dice, and you roll a bucket of dice, and you score a hit on the opponent for each 6 that you roll. You roll those hits and you apply them on the attacker. Then the attacker rolls dice with the blocks that are available at that point and inflicts hits on the opponent. Then the 2 sides have to take morale checks. A block will have to take a morale check for each hit that the block received. You roll a die. If the result is higher than the morale value of the units, then the unit failed the morale test and has to move to the failed morale area. Now, after this is done, the players may choose to retreat. Retreat voluntarily cuts your losses. If you decide to retreat, then you simply move back, and you have to take fire from the opponent as you're retreating. But you're retreating in an orderly fashion, so the fire is not too bad. You get each cube of the opponent that is still in the fight gets to roll a die to attack you, and so it's a normal attack, but with only 1 die per unit. However, it may just be that you have to retreat because you have no units that are left in the line, maybe because everybody, well, if it was eliminated, you don't have to worry about retreating, but probably a mix of elimination or failed morale. So you simply don't have anybody left there. You have to retreat. In that case, a disorderly retreat is pretty gruesome because the opponent gets to roll dice as normal in combat. That is, they get to roll against you the normal number of dice that they would roll in combat, and you don't get, of course, to roll back because you are retreating. So the battle continues until one of the two sides is completely eliminated or one of the two sides retreats because of any combination of eliminations and failed morale checks. And again, retreat may be voluntary or not. So when it comes to the specific unique aspects here, the one aspect that I haven't mentioned yet is trenches. Yes, you can spend the movement points with your units to build trenches, and they give you an advantage in combat, of course. Other than that, again, there are the unique abilities of the leaders. But other than that, the game really doesn't add much to the core engine. Maybe that was the idea behind the design. The first game in the system, we show off the system. We don't add much other stuff. Of course, there are the unique aspects that are created by the map. Other games will have a different one. It's a good system. I really like the system. I think this has great promise. Gee, I can play a campaign of the American Civil War in 2 hours. That is not something that you see every day. And even more rarely is it done successfully, and this actually is a fun and successful game. Successful in the sense that it's fun to play, it is interesting, and at the same time, it feels that it gives you an experience of the challenges that were faced historically by the commanders involved in the action. So, hooray, I'm excited about the system, and I really enjoyed this specific implementation of the system already. And I wasn't sure, when as I started playing the game felt a little too easy too easy to figure it out. The Union was simply pushing with the Juggernaut, the South was doing what they could by putting trenches out, using cavalry screenings, retreating in an orderly fashion to delay the opponent. And yes, that seemed obvious, but then there came a time when the Union launched a powerful attack against Richmond, and a couple of unlucky rolls turned that into a bloodshed, and then all of a sudden the strategy of the Union had to change because the Union got dangerously close to that level where if you go under that level, you lose the game immediately because of the staggering losses that you have experienced with the level of remaining strength points on the board. So actually it turns out that it may work, but simply driving through the board, pile driving through the board, just going down as fast as possible and as brutally as possible may not necessarily be the best idea. You may have to coordinate with the largest masses that come from the north with the smaller groups that are on the board at the beginning. You may have to try to find other ways of collecting points. Conquering Richmond is not the only way. You can also cut supply lines of the south by blocking railroads, and that also scores points. I think that it's less obvious, but it will become less obvious. It becomes less obvious, and it becomes challenging and interesting if the Confederate player plays well. Playing the Confederate side is more challenging because you are outnumbered, the Union is everywhere and they're incredibly powerful. So if you don't find the right balance between holding your ground when necessary and trading time for space and retreating when is the time to do, then simply you will be annihilated. The Confederate player is on the defensive and needs to be creative and needs to be flexible because all the Confederate player can do is to react creatively to the different directions that the Union player will be pushing from. And that needs to be done again with great care, a great sense of timing. So in a sense, probably it's more fun to play the Confederate player the Confederate side if more challenging. But again, the Union side is less obvious to play and less straightforward than it may appear at first. I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased with this game, against Gramble, with the specific challenges that this completely non-symmetrical config presents the map, the abilities of the units, of the leaders. Really, everything goes together well. The experience is smooth, and it does what it promises, which is to give you a representation of a campaign of the American Civil War in a fashion that is fully playable, and in terms of complexity, and also fully playable lengthwise. And at the same time, well, being a very good game on its own, this game also is a very good introduction to a system for which I see great promise. I'm very excited about the system. I think this is a system that can do a lot, and I'm really excited and curious to see where the system goes in the future, which I will see soon, because in the next days or weeks, tops, if I'm very busy, I will play the other games in the blue and gray campaign system, and I will report my impressions to you in my videos. This is all for today. This is all for Grant's Gamble, the first game in this new system by Worthington Games. Very good game, very promising system. Stay tuned and you will learn more about the next installments in the series.